Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the World Media Group webinar discussing how the US election will likely impact global business and trade. My name is Damien Douglas, SVP of the World Media Group and EMEA Managing Director at Time. I briefly wanted to set today's conversation up prior to handing over to our esteemed editorial guests and experts. 2020 has been a year of transformation from the pandemic through to social movements and now the US election. We've managed to cover most of that over the last 8 months, so I thank you for those that are rejoining us, and for new guests, welcome. I wanted to cover quickly who we are at the World Media Group and a little bit of housekeeping. So the World Media Group is an alliance of leading international media organizations that connects brands with highly engaged, influential audiences and renowned journalism. We're really fortunate to have today's group with us. So I'd like to specifically thank them and Robin, the MD of the Economist Intelligence Unit up front, for directing this conversation. Prior to jumping in, please do ask questions and post questions at a box on the bottom of your screen. And if you want to apply a hashtag, use hashtag WMG US elections. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Robin Bew, who, as I mentioned, is MD at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and he'll take you through the next 45 minutes or so before handing back over to me for closing. So Robin, over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Damien, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. As Damien said, my name is Robin Bew. I'm the Managing Director of the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is the research and consulting division of the Economist Group. And perhaps for the purposes of this session for the next hour or so, perhaps more importantly, is I was formerly the Editorial Director and Chief Economist, so I'm very focused on what's happening all around the world, but particularly I have a specific interest in what's happening in the US. So welcome to this discussion, which is obviously going to be about the US election and particularly the implications of that for trade and business, so both within America, but also internationally. So we're going to hear from our expert panelists in a moment. And those panelists are drawn from some of the world's leading global media organizations. Following a discussion with them about some of the key issues, we will then take some questions from you, the audience, which we're going to manage electronically. So there should be an opportunity for you to type questions into a box, and I'll get to pick some of those to put to the audience. But we're trying to have a really good debate and cover as much of the issues that are important to you as we possibly can. Before we dive in, I'm going to briefly introduce you to our panelists. We've got a very strong panel today, which makes these things a real pleasure to chair. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I think you have the bios in the pre-read material. So just very briefly, we're joined by Jacqueline Almany, who is a politics reporter and the author of Power Up newsletter at the Washington Post. I know she's just filed that newsletter for today, so has just joined us hot from filing that. So Jacqueline has broken a number of stories for the Post in recent years, including Michael Cohen's submission of fake insurance claims on behalf of President Trump. And prior to being at the Washington Post, she spent quite a long time at CBS News. We're also joined by Charlie Campbell. He's East Asia Bureau Chief for Time magazine. He's joining us from Shanghai. Writes a lot about global trade and technology, particularly clearly from a Chinese perspective, being based out there in China. He's interviewed a number of leading political figures, the President of the Philippines, the President of South Korea, and the Thai and Pakistani prime ministers. But I think most interestingly, from my perspective, he's also interviewed the Dalai Lama. So well done for staying in China, having done that. Jennifer Cunningham joins us. She's executive editor at Insider Inc., also the president of the Newswomen's Club of New York. So thank you very much for joining us. And then finally, Derek Thompson, staff writer at The Atlantic. He writes on economics, tech, and the media. He's also the author of Hitmakers, and he hosts a podcast called Crazy Genius, which doubtless we will be touching on some of those things over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Clearly, what we're going to discuss here is how Biden presidency impacts on the domestic business environment, global trade, and the environment for international investment. I think where I'd like to start, though, is just to recognise that Biden's victory, which was widely predicted, was by a much narrower margin than perhaps the polls suggested. And it looks likely that the Democrats will not be able to carry the Senate either, which leaves us with divided Congress. So how challenging do the panel think that is going to make it for Biden to implement his policy agenda? And I think we should start with Jacqueline. So Jacqueline, how difficult is it going to be for Biden in these circumstances?
Well, I want to challenge you there because the two Senate races that are coming up, the runoffs in Georgia, I think could give Democrats the majority that they need to actually be productive members of the federal government. You know, I spent the last week leading up to the election in Georgia and was on the ground and really felt and saw firsthand this burgeoning blue wave in the state that's really been building up since 2016, sort of poetic the way it's all, you know, come to play. John Ossoff was, you know, ostensibly the person who kicked off the resistance against President Trump, and now he's the person who might tilt the Senate in favor of Democrats if he's able to beat incumbent Republican David Perdue, and I think has a really good shot of that. Just, you know, when you're looking at the way changing demographics in Georgia, along with the amount of new registered voters in the state, and the robust turnout that we've seen happen. And as the votes are still being counted, Georgia has yet to be called, but President-elect Biden is ahead in the state. And that could really make all the difference. I'm not sure anyone could have anticipated that Georgia would be the tipping point for Democrats. But, you know, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue are in, you know, sort of went downhill in the polls in the last month after a number of just, I think, you know, off-color statements and just botching of certain things. And if this sitting President Trump, doesn't agree to help these Republicans and rally for them and, you know, contribute to helping Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to maintain his Senate majority, then they could very well lose, because at the end of the day, the president is still the turnout machine. But I do think it is going to be extraordinarily difficult for Vice President-elect to get anything done if the Senate doesn't flip. He's going to be sandwiched by people like AOC on the left and then a Republican Senate on the right. So it's really unclear outside of executive actions what those first, you know, the agenda is going to be in the first few months, other than a relief bill, which I think could potentially be passed ASAP.
So, I mean, clearly, from what you're saying, this is absolutely crucial what's going to happen in Georgia in terms of the Senate, because effectively it's the difference between effective and really real challenges being effective. I mean, we should go to Derek. So, Derek, what do you, I mean, firstly, what do you think is going to happen with the Senate? And then on the basis of that, again, same question, how easy or difficult is it going to be for Biden?
Yeah, so first in the Georgia Senate, you know, I think that what we just saw is that Georgia is a 50-50 state. And I think that if you're a betting man, a betting woman, a 50-50 state should go 50-50. There are two Senate runoffs. Let's assume that Democrats get one of them. Let's say it's Senator Warnock, and let's assume that Republicans get the other, Senator Perdue. I think that is sort of my null hypothesis for the January 5th runoff, is that Democrats and Republicans basically split it 50-50. But this is really a situation of who knows, because runoff Senate elections tend to have much lower turnout than general elections, which means that if it has the same turnout, or if for whatever reason one side gets really, really excited in the next month about it, and likely both sides will, it's just very, very difficult for anyone to model what's going to happen in a runoff election. So let's just say 50-50. If it's 50-50, Republicans control the Senate. And if Republicans control the Senate, what Jacqueline said is exactly right. Biden is sandwiched between a Republican Congress, or excuse me, a Republican Senate that under Mitch McConnell specializes in stalemate, specializes in doing as little as possible legislatively when there's a Democratic president. That's what we saw in the final 4 years under President Obama. Obama tried to pass stimulus bills as the economy was slowly recovering out of the Great Recession, and basically nothing got through. So yeah, maybe Biden learns from the example of the Obama administration and tries to push through more policy through executive order rather than relying on a do-nothing legislature, because that is probably what we're going to get under Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of the Republican Party. I do think, though, now what you said is exactly right. The first bill that we're likely to get, maybe the only bill that I have any degree of confidence over, is some sort of COVID stimulus package. So what that could include is bumped up unemployment insurance, state and local relief, school funding. Biden talked a lot about school funding on the campaign trail and in the debates. And we could get money for hospitals and money for expediting COVID research, whether it's therapeutics or, the fantastic news that came out this morning about Pfizer, money that goes into manufacturing all the elements of the assembly line of going from the bench science of the vaccine to the final product of, pumping that vaccine into the fleshy part of everybody's arm. So I imagine they're going to spend a lot of money on that as well. And other than that, I think from the legislative front, if you do have a Republican Senate, I think that legislatively, the US is not going to be as productive as Democrats were hoping when they were looking an electoral map on November 2nd, November 1st, and thinking we have a really good shot, according to Nate Silver, a 3 and 4 shot of winning not only the presidency, but also the Senate.
Okay. Well, Jennifer, I mean, I think some pretty difficult messages there about how hard it might be for Biden. But of course, Biden, he's built his political career of being able to reach out across the aisle. Implicit in the comments we've just heard so far is he's just not going to be able to do that now he's in the White House. I mean, do you think that's correct? That his charm at reaching out, trying to bridge some of this partisan divide can't be effective?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. First off, good morning, everyone. So happy to be here. I think Biden has really made his name on reaching across the aisle, on creating bipartisan support for his various policies and agendas. And I think he's going to walk into this administration January 20th doing more of the same. He's known Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell for a very long time. I don't know if they're necessarily friends, but they definitely have a rapport. They've worked together before. So I think that Biden is going to be harnessing, I guess, what little goodwill there may be, and trying to turn that into actionable policy and really kind of move his agenda forward. I think that one of the first things he is going to be working on is trying to craft a stimulus that can that both sides can agree on. I think that is going to be a challenge. I think Mitch McConnell didn't even want to pass a stimulus when it would have benefited Trump. So I think that there's going to be definitely some challenges there. But I think all in all, this is going to be a president who is known for reaching across the aisle and creating that sort of bipartisan support. So I'm going into this thinking that there's going to be more of the same in that regard.
Okay, I'm going to come back to Derek and Jacqueline on that in a second, but I want to talk to Charlie. So you're obviously the only one of the panelists sitting outside of the US at the moment. So you're sitting in Shanghai. So I guess a couple of things. So firstly, what does it look like from China perspective, and perhaps if you could pretend you're captain of the rest of the world, what does it look like if Biden doesn't have control of the Senate and therefore is somewhat hamstrung? And then, of course, we do know that the presidents without the Congress have a lot more control over foreign policy. They do about what's happening domestically. So if you're in China, if you're President Xi right now, what does this look like to him?
Hi, Robin, and thanks everyone. Great to be here. The optics of having a kind of gridlock in the Senate isn't particularly good for the kind of American display of democracy and sort of like liberal governance. But in terms of foreign policy, it doesn't really make that much a difference. I mean, President Trump tended to sort of execute policy by executive order. Like, as you said, Biden have a lot more freedom to act on foreign policy. There's a chance that if he is completely gridlocked in domestic policy, that maybe he will be looking for foreign policy to make some kind of moves to get some early successes on the board. But then the question is really how much will is there to act on this stuff? Because politically, the winds have really changed. I mean, obviously sitting here, the trade war is the number one kind of the elephant in the room. How much would Biden want to roll back tariffs, attack that, undo some of Trump's sort of attempts to impose costs on China? I don't think politically there really is that much will to kind of let China off. I think that all this Beijing Biden stuff on the stump will make him a bit wary of that. And maybe there'll be something that shall hold up for the first summit between Xi and Biden. They have some kind of deliverables to come out of that. And regarding tech, Huawei, TikTok, WeChat, this kind of stuff, there's big bipartisan support for being harsh on China. This goes down to national security. You've got, FBI Director Christopher Wray being very tough on China. And so it's a really, even if Biden has got the free hand to act and make some progress on these matters, is how much he really wants to roll back Trump's agenda, which has become broader, has gained broader support than it's maybe had at the outset. There was a lot of speculation that perhaps Biden would want to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But then again, the winds of change. His Buy American policy would seem to preclude that. There's very much a kind of nod to the nativist approach, which Trump supporters very much favor. There's also the chance that the 11 remaining members of TPP wouldn't want the US back in. They froze 22 articles, which, including protections for US workers, in order to move forward with it. So really, would they want to impose those back into the agreement in order to have the US sign up? So yeah, it's not entirely sure whether, even if Biden has got more wherewithal to act in international affairs via executive order, whether really politically he will feel free to do so.
Just, I guess we're already getting a few questions from the panelists. So on trade, but not on China. But maybe Charlie, I'll stick with you for a second. There's a question here about whether Biden will be much more reluctant than Trump would have been to do a trade deal with the UK. So obviously, we have a lot of people on this call from the UK who are very interested in that. I mean, do you think that Biden being elected materially changes the chances of the UK and the US reaching some kind of trade accommodation?
Well, from what I understand, I mean, Biden is, Irish Catholic, very big on the Irish border situation of Brexit, very anti-Brexit, and I don't know if he'd be quite so keen to hand Boris Johnson an easy win with this regard without some kind of a concession with an issue which is very strong to his heart. So I think it's certainly that Boris Johnson and the Conservative government in the UK is not in such a strong position as with a Biden government than Trump, who was very, very pro-Brexit and had Nigel Farage campaigning up with him during the election. So it remains to be seen how that all plays out. But I would say that it doesn't appear great for the UK at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Jacqueline, I just want to come back to something that Jennifer was saying. We were just talking about Biden's predilection for sort of reaching across the aisle and the possibility that he may be able to get something done through that mechanism. Do you think that's less likely? It sounded like you're not that optimistic about his ability to pull that off.
Yeah, this might come across as cynical, but I've just sort of questioned the Biden campaign's, bipartisan approach at spending all of this energy wrangling in moderate Republicans, basically the entire cycle. And you heard, or you saw Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, articulate this idea herself in a New York Times interview over the weekend, where she said that it's insane that if, members of the Biden campaign team and the president-elect himself believe that, it's people like John Kasich, a moderate Republican, former governor of Ohio, are the reason, why the former vice president won this election. He's not the reason why Black voters turned out in Detroit, Philadelphia. And that's actually due to, the grassroots efforts of progressive icons, really, like Stacey Abrams, AOC. So I also don't think that Republicans at the end of the day have any interest in suddenly taking up Democratic legislation that's been sitting on the Senate floor for years now. They're not suddenly going to embrace, comprehensive gun safety legislation. I think that, the president-elect is lucky in that a lot of his priorities right off the bat can be addressed with executive orders like climate change, healthcare, and he doesn't really have to get to the whole writing new trade deals quite yet, because that is something that I also think can pick at some schisms within the Democratic Party as well. But I think from a superficial standpoint, there'll be civility, sure. And you're not going to see the kind of insults traded like we saw with President Trump, who really fed off of that chaos and indulged it and did it at all hours of the night. That's, I think, going to be, it's safe to assume that's going to be a thing of the past, except I guess if Trump continues to tweet, which he probably will. But I don't foresee, that much more getting done if it's a divided government.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, I just want to come back and sort of follow on from these thoughts about effectiveness. So obviously we've talked about Biden and the challenge that he will face if Congress is divided, and notwithstanding Jacqueline's point that may not be the case. And one of the questions actually we've had is about how aggressively the two parties might fight for Georgia on the basis that it's going to be so important. But of course, the other thing which has happened over the last few years is that the judiciary in the US has sort of moved to the right fairly substantially, not just at the Supreme Court, which is getting all the headlines, but I think across federal courts across the whole of the country. So there has been a pretty steady shift to the right in terms of judiciary. In instances where a president is having to govern more through executive order, chances are you might well see more policy issues ending up in court. I mean, do you think that what's happened in the courts over the last few years is also going to make life more difficult for Biden? Or do you think that's a red herring?
I think it is going to make things more difficult. I think specifically, I'm thinking about the Supreme Court and, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, going for oral arguments this week. I think that is definitely going to be a challenge. And Biden himself has talked about, he hasn't come out in favor of court packing for the Supreme Court, but he has said that he's going to put together a panel to see if something like that is feasible, just to kind of tilt the balance more back in liberals' favor, make it a little bit more balanced. But I do think that if he's not able to pass things through legislation, I think the courts are going to be blocking him by and large.
Okay, thank you. Derek, do you see that as well? Do you think that the courts are going to play a more important role now we've got a Democratic president and the courts have moved to the right?
Yeah, I absolutely do see a showdown between, look, either the legislative road is going to be blocked in all likelihood by Mitch McConnell. There's absolutely a possibility that Democrats win both of the runoffs, but I think they're at best going to probably win one. That means legislatively it's going to be very difficult to do anything after you pass the COVID stimulus bill. As a result, you're going to have Biden leaning more on executive order, and those executive orders are more likely to be challenged in court. The entire game plan for Republicans was to establish themselves in the judiciary over the last 4 years so that when Democrats started to pass progressive legislation or started to do anything progressive from executive order, they were already aligned, like, chess pieces on a board, ready to stymie Democrats whenever they tried to do anything that they didn't want to do. This is one of the reasons why I do think that Biden has a very different attitude about government, even than Obama did. He's much more hands-on. He believes, I think, about in the power of individual relationships in a way that people who knew Obama say that he wasn't necessarily as devoted to trying to cultivate individual relationships with Republicans. And as a result, there's some optimism that he could get something done. He could surprise us in some way on the legislative side. The reason I'm a little pessimistic about that is this. I think that Biden's bipartisan talk was extremely successful in the campaign. If you look at where Biden improved on 2016 margins over Hillary Clinton, yes, he did fantastically among the cities. Democrats dominate in cities. But where he won is the suburbs of Atlanta, in the suburbs of Arizona, in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Milwaukee and Detroit. He won in the suburbs where you have a lot of high income, high educated people who don't necessarily want to be think about politics all the time, to have the specter, the wraith of Donald Trump hovering over their lives every single second of every day. They wanted someone in government who's going to talk in a harmonious way about the future. And that's exactly what Biden offered them, is this return to normalcy. That's fantastic for campaigning. You campaign in poetry, govern in prose. The prose of government right now is in all likelihood going to be the stalemate offered by Mitch McConnell. So yeah, you can maybe get COVID stimulus through, but what happens after that? Democrats want a Green New Deal, a $2 trillion climate bill. Mitch McConnell is not going to be very helpful working with Democrats on a $2 trillion climate deal. Another thing that Biden talked about is rolling back the Republican corporate income tax cut. You think Mitch McConnell, whose only legislative achievement really of the last 4 years was cutting the marginal income tax rate for corporations down to whatever 20-21%, is going to be likely to negotiate with Joe Biden to unwind his singular legislative achievement? No way. So I think that Biden offers, yes, a different test of the hypothesis that it's impossible to get anything done in the American government these days legislatively unless you control every branch. But I am a little bit pessimistic that beyond COVID and beyond the stimulus afforded by the crisis of COVID, a great deal more is going to be done in the last, say, 3.5 years of his presidency, unless Democrats win both Senate seats or somehow have a big 2022.
I mean, the obvious question flow from that, maybe I'll ask Jacqueline and then we get Charlie to comment out for someone sitting outside of the US at the moment, is if you're running a business in America, if you're the CEO of a large domestic company, or you're running a business which is a foreign business which is invested in America, what does this mean for you? I mean, we're talking, I mean, most of the comments here suggest, and notwithstanding the possibility that Democrats take those Senate seats in Georgia, would largely all of you agree that it's going to be really hard for Biden to make a whole lot of progress. Obviously, we have a lot of people on this call who are running businesses that are very exposed to the US economy. I mean, Jacqueline, what does it mean if you're running a US business, if you're running a business in the States, this kind of political backdrop?
That's a good question. I mean, the landscape will certainly be far more stable, which I think any business would welcome. But, you know, I think it's going to be quite, I don't think that the priority of this president-elect right now is going to be, you know, rewriting and pushing through a tax plan. And I think things are going to largely remain the same. And again, with regards to trade policy, it's, you know, with the coronavirus again and other domestic priorities that have reached, you know, a crisis level, there are just other things that need to get done before new trade deals are rewritten. And you know, on top of that, we've seen that the president-elect is a bit more progressive than Obama was and Hillary Clinton was when it comes to trade deals, and actually is more labor friendly and might be more of a protectionist than Democrats have been in the past. So it's really TBD. And I think, you know, if some sort of healthcare is, I don't want to say pushed through because it's not going to be possible in a divided government, but if there's some executive order passed, that also will stabilize the market as well. And I think a stimulus package will keep everyone afloat until there's a vaccine for all. So I think all in all, it's a positive for businesses, right? Because I do think, although this was a huge faction in the campaign, and, you know, obviously Trump and Biden took very separate views of how intertwined the coronavirus crisis is with the economy. I don't think it's hard at this point to see those, especially as we're going into, you know, another potential economic downfall in the US. It's hard to separate the two.
Okay, thank you. I mean, Charlie, you're obviously sitting in China. Clearly, China's view about what this means is very specific because the China relationship with the US is so tense. But if we could just broaden out your thinking to just more generally for maybe Southeast Asian businesses, does Biden being in the White House, even in this environment where Democrats don't have control of the Senate, does that still look a better bet for businesses that are trying to trade with or invest in America than a Trump presidency?
It will give a little bit more confidence to you know, former allies which have felt the brunt of Trump's or current allies who have historic allies, I should say, who have felt the brunt of Trump's sort of unilateral you know, sanctions and sort of tariffs and this kind of stuff. It's not been very easy going trying to sort of be friends with a you know, a Trump administration, which is on the best of days, it's sort of passive aggressive towards allies, and on when he's trying to whip up a crowd, he's openly hostile. So I think a sort of return to more consensus-based alliances, going through the WTO more than unilateral kind of tariffs and this kind of stuff would definitely allow businesses to plan better, a bit more, inject a little bit more confidence to the markets and stuff. But I mean, the main thing is that the US has to get a handle on the coronavirus. I mean, it's the world's biggest economy, and it's absolutely hobbled at the moment. And so, even if Biden is kind of hamstrung or deadlocked by the Senate, if he can actually enact an aggressive policy to get a handle on the virus, then this will be, in the long run, a fantastic thing for any business which has to deal a lot with the US, because at the moment it's very hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, other than a vaccine. But I mean, in terms of US firms in China, a lot of the executives I speak to were broadly sort of in favor of Trump's harsh approach to China, because they've grown quite weary of being in the China market, seeing such glacial progress regarding opening up and this kind of thing, access to markets, rollback of regulations and stuff. So when Trump came in and was acting very, very tough, they were kind of in favor. However, the kind of sledgehammer approach, the very erratic approach, ended up being quite stressful. I think every day they're waking up and seeing a new kind of broadside attacks on, closing of the Houston consulate and the media war and the banning of different apps and stuff. So this ended up being a little bit, a little bit stressful and sort of angst-ridden. And so I think they're looking forward to going back to a more traditional approach under President Biden, who will, stick to the game plan of the normal rules of kind of diplomatic relations.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question. I don't want to spend too long on this unless someone is going to really surprise us, but we've had a question about peaceful transition of power, and clearly Trump is not conceding, so goodness knows whether he will or not. But I guess if we take it as a starting assumption is that we think that we're going to get to 20th of January and Biden will be sworn in and no massive bumps along the road. But I think we should check, because the panel is asking, do we all think that, or is anyone worrying that perhaps some of these legal challenges might actually cause some more significant dislocation in the political process? I mean, is anyone concerned about any of this? Think that Trump may find a wedge here that he can use to make this transition much more complicated than we're currently assuming?
I'm not particularly worried about the legal challenges, but I do think that the next 2 months might be extremely dangerous times, and the impulse to distract and cause a crisis to try and buy some time or just to deflect or sow discord might be too tempting. So the legal challenges doesn't really worry me, but I think that the gloves are off, and Trump may be a wounded animal, and it might be liable to do some things which are quite damaging.
Okay, we're getting some nodding. So Jacqueline's unmuted already. So start with Jacqueline. We'll come to Jennifer. Sorry, it's the first person.
I agree. I think that the legal challenges that President Trump have mounted are flimsy at best. It doesn't appear that they're going to prevail. My concern is that Trump is going to energize maybe the extreme right-wing portion of his base, the so-called militias, this, that, and the third, and that may create some sort of domestic instability, to put it fairly. And so I think that that's the concern. Also, I do think that Trump now is a wounded animal. He said just before the election that he hates to lose. His back is in the corner. And so I think another concern is that he's going to adopt sort of a scorched earth policy in these last 2 months at the helm of the country. And I'm worried about what that's going to mean for the American people, and how that's going to kind of manifest in our day-to-day lives.
Okay, thank you. Jacqueline, you're also unmuted, so I assume you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, so this is actually what we wrote about this morning. I talked to a bunch of White House aides and Trump campaign staffers over the weekend who essentially said, actually, let me pull up the quote so I don't botch it. But in a sentence, that the legal operation is designed for the president to save face and ultimately give him the ability to say he didn't lose the election fair and square, so we're going to roll with it. There is sort of this private acceptance that, if this is what it takes to get the president out of office peacefully, this is what we're going to do. It's a public relations campaign. They are deploying staffers to Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, but those staffers are not thrilled to be going. It's a paycheck for them at this point. This isn't exactly, I think what you would see from a campaign that truly believes that they wrongfully lost this election. But where the problem is in certain, I think, technical problems, other than, the president sowing disinformation, chaos, and discord, which is very problematic, obviously. But in terms of the transfer of power, for example, my colleague scooped this last night that the General Services Administration administrator has refused to sign off a letter that would provide the Biden transition team with millions of dollars, office space, equipment authorized for the transition team, and that would, essentially facilitate the transfer of power and give them access to the documents and everything that they need to make sure that this happens gracefully and quickly. And this is more important than ever as we're trying to stave off a bigger body count with regards to the coronavirus crisis. And if the president continues to behave like this and has his political appointees like Emily Murphy, the GSA administrator, refusing to do things that have always historically been done, that's where it becomes a problem. I'm not necessarily caught up with, the president upending the 1500th, historical precedent of his administration. But in terms of technical things like this, it's important and problematic.
Okay, so you've all depressed me now. Maybe
actually, can I just?
Up there?
Yeah, I really want to emphasize what Jacqueline just said, because I think it's exactly right. The danger is not that Trump does anything. The danger is that he does nothing. Presidential transitions are really, really hard. It's very, very difficult and very, very important that outgoing administrations help incoming administrations deal with ongoing crises. Like it happened in 92, it happened in 96, 2000, 2004. In none of those years were we dealing with a pandemic. So it is more important than ever that administrations help each other hand over the reins of government at a time when 1,000 people are dying in the US every single day of this disease. So the danger is not that he does anything, the danger is that he does nothing. And I think it's really important to say that this administration, in all likelihood, will die the same way that it lived, which is with the president having authoritarian impulses, but being frankly too incompetent and lazy to actually install those authoritarian impulses in policy. So yes, you're going to see scary, scary stuff potentially on Twitter, but it is just so highly unlikely that any of these lawsuits amount to anything. It's far more likely that the real danger is that, just as Jacqueline said, the administration is so unhelpful to this administration is so unhelpful to the incoming Biden team that they can't hit the ground running in January, which means that we might lose several months, several weeks, who knows how long, in terms of enacting a superior COVID policy.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, I just want to come back to trade. So obviously Trump tariff policy was front and center of his sort of view about how you implemented international trade policy. Biden said he thinks about things slightly differently. So we've heard him talk about sort of supply chain self-sufficiency. We've talked about US government investment and US government contracts back to domestic firms, maybe a bit more action around sort of trade action enforcement. So do you think that even if Biden, specifically with Biden and China, that he may remain suspicious of China in a way that perhaps Trump was, but do you think the tools of that will be so different that it's going to feel different for international businesses? I mean, are we going to see a complete change in the tactics that are being used?
It's still early days, and to see exactly how he plans to go after China. Certainly the competition is still there, and I don't see any return to the kind of fulsome engagement of the Obama and George W. Bush administrations. But this seems to be the way which both sides are going in terms of a more nativist approach. We just had the fifth plenum of the CCP, where they're drafting the new 5-year plan. And then the buzzword there is this dual circulation strategy. So China is trying to maintain its export economy, but also ramp up domestic consumption. And at the moment, I think it's 57% of China's GDP growth is now domestic consumption. And so there's definitely on both sides of the Pacific, there's this movement towards getting business back home, anti-globalist kind of agendas, and trying to and then decoupling of the most sensitive technology. So I think Biden will definitely pursue this. I don't think he'll be quite as heavy on the tariffs. I don't think he wants to roll them back straight away, just for politically it might look like he's being too soft on China. But I don't believe he thinks they work, as does, I don't think anyone really believes they've done anything good. So yeah, I think we're heading the same direction, but hopefully in a more measured and kind of predictable way.
You said something interesting with lots of interesting things, but one thing that really piqued my attention was that sort of tech and sort of bringing supply chains back home. One of the things that looks like it might be starting to happen is this sort of bifurcation of the sort of global tech environment, where China is developing a series of technology standards that have been rejected by the US and their allies, and vice versa. Do you think the end game here is we're going to end up in a world in which there are two sort of ecosystems for tech and possibly other things, finance, in which it's quite difficult to run a company that actually straddles those two things? You're either going to be in the US and the allied camp, or you're going to be in China's camp, and it's going to be really hard to run a business that straddles both.
We're already there in some ways. The Great Firewall, it goes both ways. It's not just about keeping Chinese internet users sequestered in their own internet, but it's also, it stops people from outside of China getting in. So we're already heading there. It depends. I'm sure there will be methods for companies who want to exist in both spheres to kind of engage them. But certainly with the way that the US in particular has been so aggressive at shutting out Huawei and GTE and TikTok and this kind of stuff, I think that some kind of decoupling is inevitable. But then again, it really depends on the level that goes down. Is it going to be just the highest tech, the infrastructure kind of stuff, or is it going to be about commercial apps and everything? But then, and of course, you've got to put a lot of blame at China. You can't use WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. They started this ball rolling, and so much as it's not in the sort of liberal democratic principles which we have come to expect of a free internet, to be banning apps just because of their provenance and because they're Chinese. Maybe a little bit of a few reciprocal jibes like that might not be the worst thing.
Okay. Anyone else got any thoughts about how easy or difficult it might be for American businesses to continue to operate effectively in places like China?
Yeah, sure, I can take this. I think Charlie is basically right. I do think that for a variety of reasons, both political and macroeconomic, a certain amount of decoupling seems somewhat inevitable in the next few years. Ongoing decoupling seems somewhat inevitable. When China was an economy that depended primarily on exports in order to maintain its 6, 7, 8, 9% GDP annual growth, you needed a certain degree of openness. But as the country has gotten a lot richer, as its middle class has benefited from economic growth, you have a larger part of that economy that is coming from the consumer side rather than the international trade side. And that allows Xi, I think, to rely on a strategy that closes off China a little bit, because there is an element of self-sufficiency. And so in that case, the sort of 20-year economic story feeds into the 2020 technology story. There is a self-sufficiency that exists within the Chinese system as an economy. So I think that that's another element of this as well. But I do think that, there are a lot of there may be 4 levels to the US-China showdown right now. You have the sort of producer side economic level, companies in America competing with companies in China. And from that perspective, you clearly have a lot of tech companies that did see, or a lot of other companies, I should say, maybe even not just tech, who were furious at how China was treating their businesses for years, and were somewhat relieved that finally you had someone in the White House who was, talking publicly and unapologetically about exactly how they felt about how unfair China was in terms of stealing their technology and regulating them out of the market. At the same time, though, when the tariffs started, I was a little bit more concerned about another layer of this, which was the consumer side. How much would the Chinese tariffs hurt American consumers? I haven't seen the best numbers on that. I think it's been a little bit hard to game out, just because there's been other sort of economic trends, like the pandemic, that has made it really difficult to sort of cash out what share of America's declining GDP in Q2 is the result of the tariffs. Like, a lot of it is COVID. But then you have sort of rhetoric and politics. On rhetoric, I think Biden's going to be much more normal. He is much less likely to tweet scary things about China, but behind the scenes, he might be fighting for some of the same policies that you saw trade representatives fighting for in terms of protecting US markets, especially those that Biden talked a lot about, like those that exist in the Rust Belt in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And then finally, there's politics. The politics of US-Chinese relations have changed so much in the last 5 years. You had this feeling, I think, 5 years ago that the US and China were going to muddle their way through this complicated relationship. And right now, on the far right, you have anti-Chinese rhetoric. On the far left, you have anti-Chinese rhetoric. In the middle, you have, at the very least, skepticism about the degree to which the US should forgive China for what's going on in Xinjiang and what they're doing to Hong Kong. And there's all this political gnarliness that's tied up into the US-Chinese relationship in a way that you didn't necessarily have those political elements on the front burner when you were talking about US-Chinese relations. So I think that overall, yes, you're going to have Biden. This is again, doubling down on what Charlie said, we're going to hear different rhetoric about China, absolutely. But under the hood, I'm not sure how much changes, and I'm certainly not anticipatory of any quick change, precisely because there is just so much on Biden's plate, and he can't immediately swing toward liberalizing relations with China before he fixes the domestic problem with the economy and the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting loads of great questions from the audience. I'm going to go with one of those and just expand it a bit. Maybe, Jennifer, I'll start with you on this. So the question narrowly is, do we think it's realistic for Trump to run in 2024? Well, we should broaden that out a bit. In 2024, is it Trump? Is it someone related to Trump? Is it someone who sounds like Trump? Or is it someone who sounds much more like a traditional Republican? And where do you think we're going on this?
Honestly, I think it's still early days. I think that Trump has just a tremendous following in the United States. And I was really surprised that 70 million people voted for him and that the race was as close as it was. I think that there's an argument to a certain extent that Trump has become the GOP and the GOP is Trump. But I think now that, especially with Trump's behavior over these last few days, that there's going to be sort of a decoupling that's going to be happening over these next few years, and people thinking about new blood. It could be Ivanka in 2024, but I don't know how much the public is going to have an appetite for Trump going forward. I think it just, even in light of the last 6 months or so. But that being said, I do think that he does have a solid base. He does have people who are going to be following him regardless of what he's doing. So that's going to be an interesting balance and a line to walk that the Republicans are going to have to kind of figure out going into 2024.
Okay. And Jacqueline, Trump, the sequel, how realistic?
Yeah, in conversations, private conversations with his aides and people close to him, they've immediately all said, sort of made threats. He'll run again. He'll announce his re-election bid on Joe Biden's inauguration day. But I don't think those are serious in any way. But as Brad Parscale told my colleagues over the weekend, the president is in a position, he got 70 million votes, he can do whatever he wants to do. And for people who thought that Trumpism would disappear if this president lost the election. They're just not right. I mean, Mitt Romney said it on Sunday. He is the 900-pound gorilla in the room. Trumpism is alive and well, and he is planning on throwing his weight around, and so is Don Jr. and Ivanka Trump. There were threats over Twitter last week as from Don Jr. that they wouldn't, basically the subtext of his tweets being, you won't have our support, you won't have our rallies, our fundraising mechanisms, any of our, our grassroots power that we've really garnered over the past 5 years if you don't rally behind my dad right now. And that will continue. That being said, the president will be 79 or 76, 77. I don't know. Who knows if he'll be, in fighting shape to run in 4 years, or if he really even wants to. This president didn't think he was going to win in 2016, and he hasn't been crazy about the job, nor has he enjoyed the scrutiny that it's come with. It hasn't been great for business, and it hasn't been great for his personal brand. But I could imagine, Don Jr. definitely has a political future. He has become the top fundraiser for the party. And Ivanka Trump has seemingly, moved to the right. She came out for the first time as completely pro-life a few weeks ago. And she spoke at the convention, and I think has gotten her arms around this idea that she could be good at this too, like her father. But Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, those types, they're also already preparing for a 2024 run. A lot of people I speak with on the Hill are getting ready to retire a lot of Republicans getting ready to retire into public affairs jobs before picking one of those horses in 2022. So there's a lot floating around. TBD.
Okay, thank you. Quick, a couple of questions, because we've got a lot of questions here and not much time left to cover them in. So maybe for Derek and then Charlie, about big tech. There's a comment that Trump didn't appear to ever really contemplate taking an axe to some of these big tech firms and starting to break them up, despite the fact that there was a view that they were so dominant. Do you think that's going to be different under Biden? Maybe we start with Derek and then go on to Charlie.
This is a great question. Man, I really wish I felt strongly about the answer to this question, because that would make for a more compelling panelist answer. I honestly think that US big tech policy right now is in a state of quantum superposition. You could see the next 4 years where we basically stop talking about it, where in large part you realize that the reason that so many liberals were angry at Facebook was because they thought that Facebook elected Donald Trump, and that in a Biden administration with a growing economy and a vaccine, they just start focusing on other things, and they don't care as much about antitrust policy with the same way they didn't really talk about antitrust under Obama. I think that possibility is being underrated in the media right now. At the same time, I think that we are in a very, very different environment when it comes to, federal policy in big tech, or sort of elite opinion in big tech in 2020 than we were in 2015. It's not just what Facebook did in 2016 in terms of disinformation. It's not just the danger of Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat sort of competing with media publishers, with news publishers in terms of getting people's attention, that kind of, sort of jealousy within the information economy. It's also the fact that there's been a lot of legwork on the effect of industry consolidation, industry concentration in tech for as it relates to Amazon and Google and potentially Microsoft. And you have elites within the party who are going to potentially have Biden's year, who say this is one of the most important issues in the economy, that whatever issue you want to talk about that is a negative implication of the 2020 economy, whether it's lower wages or lower entrepreneurship, or disappointing interstate migration, which leads to a kind of mojo in the US economy, there is a paper for all those issues that suggests that, it's because of consolidation and concentration in the tech industry. So I do think that Biden's plate just is the most full plate of any incoming president I can possibly think of since FDR in 1932. So to a certain extent, political capital necessitates that you prioritize. I would be surprised if Biden prioritized big tech antitrust policy over some of the sort of meat and potatoes domestic policy, domestic economic policy stuff that he's talked about in the campaign. This is not someone at 78 who's done a great deal of thinking about exactly how to regulate Google's search function. This is a guy who's done a lot of thinking about how Americans who live at the 40th percentile can make ends meet and put food on the table. So I would expect the 78-year-old is not going to change his spots. He's going to focus on the issues he's focused on for the last 40 years. And that would probably mean domestic policy issues over tech. And I do think it's difficult if you sort of downshift a tech antitrust policy in your administration to see something dramatic happen, because, you know, busting up Google, busting up Facebook, busting up Amazon, these are massive, massive decisions that you're making at the administrative level. And I would be a little bit surprised if that happened before the domestic policy stuff.
Okay, Charlie, you write a lot about tech. Do you think Biden might want to take on some of these tech giants?
I agree. I just don't think it's going to be a priority. There's just so much going on at the moment. And these are very powerful companies with big wobbling arms, and that they can make it look like it's a very bad thing for the economy, even if down the road in the broader scheme of things, it's a net positive. In the short term, there may be economic harm, and you know, at the moment, that's the last thing Biden needs. And I just think it will be something. It's an easy can to kick down the road, and why not do that from his point of view when there's so much more going on?
Okay, so I think we're coming quite close to the end now. I think we've got just 4 minutes left, and Damien, I know, wants to say a few words at the very end. So maybe I'll try and do a little bit of summing up, and perhaps we can get one last word for everyone about their sort of big takeaway. But it seems from what we've just discussed is, firstly, Georgia is going to be really important. I think everyone's really clear. If the Democrats can take the Senate, then Biden can really get some stuff done. But I think the panel seems to be pretty united that if he can't take the Senate, it's going to start getting really difficult to move policy forwards domestically. A bit more opportunity on the international environment, and obviously he also has the option to use executive orders to get some stuff done. But we did talk a bit about the legal environment and how that perhaps was not going to look very favourably on the kind of Biden agenda, given the changes that have happened in the legal environment over the last 4 years or so. We looked at China, and I guess the big message there I took away is that even though the language might be much more polite, that there isn't really a lot of prospect that a Biden presidency is going to have a big love-in with China, that we're going to see the same suspicion, perhaps expressed in a slightly different way, and maybe some of the policy levers that Biden presidency pulls with respect to sort of economic competition with China might be a bit different, but ultimately the goals will probably be relatively similar. Not a lot of clarity on who might be a Republican candidate next time round, but I guess the one thing that I did take away is no one's ruling out the possibility that Trump might decide to run again, or one of Trump's family. So I think everything's still on the table. No one seems very keen to say that no, it's definitely going to tack back to a more traditional political style. It doesn't feel that people are sort of suggesting that. And then just in terms of the priorities, it seems that some things are just going to be too big to handle. Biden's got some priorities which are these kind of bread and butter issues around middle class incomes, and that means that some of the really big politically challenging things, such as dealing with the technology sector and the tech giants that so many people have been complaining about, that's probably too hard to take on, and it may not be an issue anyway in an environment where perhaps the political environment is a bit less contentious, and maybe you see a lot less of policy being conducted over tweets. Might mean that the big tech giants perhaps don't feature so clearly in the debate anyway. A bunch of stuff we haven't talked about, so I apologise for that. I've got questions here on climate. So we're going to Biden's promised to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord on his first day in office, but the question was, can he get anything else done? So we didn't get a chance to get to that, so I'm sorry, but questions on that, questions on UK-US relations specifically, UK-US-EU relations as well. So lots of great stuff. It's a pity we didn't have any more time, but I think we're just about out. So I'm going to hand back to Damien in a second, but before I do that, I just want to thank all the panelists. So we've got Charlie from Time Magazine, Jennifer from Insider Inc., Derek from The Atlantic, and Jacqueline from The Washington Post. I think really great insights from all of you. So thank you very much for taking the time. I think that the panelists, certainly I learned a lot. I'm hoping everyone who's dialed in learned a lot as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Damien so that he can close us off.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty succinctly. I had some notes here that said internal focus first, return to consistency, stability, and predictability, which are words that business likes, but we're not likely to get progressive international policy until they get COVID under control. So that's kind of my 30-second summary of the lot. I'd like to thank everybody, Robin, for leading a great conversation today. So thank you all, and we hope to welcome you back over the course of the next 12 months. This kind of brings to a close the series from the World Media Group that probably started back in March and covered many subjects. So thank you to everybody that's joined us over the course of the summer and now into the autumn. And, you know, I'm probably going to be the first person to wish everybody a happy Christmas. I know we're not midway through November yet, but happy Christmas from the World Media Group. And we hope to kind of connect with everybody as we turn the year into January. So thanks again to the panelists, and thanks again to everybody that's joined us over the course of the last 8-9 months. This has been new for us, but great that we can prove that live conversations work and we have multiple people re-engaging. So without further ado, thanks again, panelists, and thank you to everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.